Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today for a discussion on helping your front-end and back-end teams work together effectively. This is a lead dev webinar created in partnership with Pantheon. The webinar will last roughly 45 minutes, after which both myself and the panelists will head over to the lead dev Slack channel to answer some of your questions in hash effective-teams channel. We may also have time to answer a couple of questions live, so please do go and submit those questions through the Q&A feature on Zoom, and we'll get to them if we can towards the end. So let's get started with some introductions. My name is Raul Hepser. I'll be your moderator today, and I'm currently an engineer manager at Spotify. I'm joined by some very awesome engineer leaders on the panel today who are ready to share their experiences and insights. But first, let's get started with some intros, and I will pass the first one to Jeremy.
Yeah, wonderful to be here today. My name is Jeremy Dickens. I'm a senior solutions engineer with Pantheon, who's co-sponsoring this webinar. But my experience prior to joining Pantheon about 2.5 years ago, I've led engineering teams with web agencies and also led the content management systems team at weather.com. So I've been highly involved in teams that were integrating both front end, back end, disparate API systems into cohesive wholes. So hopefully I can, bring some of that experience to the table today.
Thank you. Philippa.
Thank you. Hey everyone, my name is Philippa, and currently I'm working at an online video editing company called Veed, where I'm leading one of their front-end engineering teams. But before I work there, I've got some experience leading a mixture of teams, so front-end, back-end, and then in one case, platform teams. And so I'm looking forward to this panel because I know it can be quite tricky to coordinate different projects and different pieces of work across those teams. And it's really hard to make sure that communication is just happening, let alone boosting communication. So hopefully I can learn something today and I can share some insights as well.
No, thank you. And Tiffany.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Tiffany Jokja. I'm an engineering manager at Autodesk. I lead the global platform engineering support at Autodesk. And so I've worked with a lot of teams from a development and operations standpoint. Prior to working at Autodesk, I led the data products organization at Vox Media. And then I was also a professional services consultant for various projects while I was at Red Hat. So super excited to share some stories and be alongside my fellow panelists today.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Tiffany. We want to highlight the importance of collaboration between backend and front-end developers because it directly impacts the quality, functionality, and user experience of the applications we build. When these teams work in silos, it can lead to miscommunication, conflict priorities, and ultimately a less cohesive product. By fostering collaboration, we can ensure that both teams are aligned in their goals, that they understand each other's needs and constraints, and that they work together efficiently to deliver a seamless and user-friendly experience. This not only improves the quality of our products, but also enhances team morale and overall productivity. So to kick off the conversations, we're going to explore first communication collaboration aspects of that perspective, from that perspective. And I have a question to kick off this conversation. What strategies have you found effective in encouraging collaboration between these two teams? Maybe Jeremy, you can share some of your experience here.
Yeah. One of the things that I feel pretty strongly about when it comes to organizing, disparate teams into actioning on specific goals is making sure that you have, clear transparency across functions. One of the things that I've seen be very successful in multiple roles has been having specific like cross-functional stand-up or group meeting so that you have representation from all teams, making sure that each team's perspective and challenges are being brought forth and not just kind of siloed in each team individually. And you can really, I think, improve the depth and the sort of reach of that collaboration by making sure that different team members get the opportunity to participate. If it's a large enough effort, you might have, 50, 60, 100 different engineers and project managers and stakeholders all involved. You don't want all of them in the meeting all at once, but making sure that people have the opportunity to join, have their concerns heard, have their voice heard, hear the concerns of the other people and other teams that are involved. I've seen that be just incredibly effective in making sure that the right tone gets set for that collaboration.
Nice. Thank you. Maybe Tiffany, you have some other tips and
Yeah. I'd love to just add on to what Jeremy was saying around having the right people in place. You as a engineering manager or leader, your people's strengths and weaknesses, and you know who to trust for specific projects. So don't be afraid to play to people's strengths on your team. If you know someone is particularly really great at leading a certain kind of meeting or delivering or working on a certain kind of feature or work, be sure to place those people in the right spaces for them to be able to drive success in the project. You want to make sure that you have point of contacts for specific things. In addition, I think it's very helpful to spend more time in the intersection between where you're going to have handoffs between these two teams. Especially for myself, I like to spend that time trying to define a lot of that up front so that you're really doing the hard work up front to be able to say, okay, this is where we're going to hand off the project, and then this is when we're going to have the meetings. So making sure that you have both the right people in place and the right handoffs, the right process for the handoffs written down is going to be very helpful in encouraging collaborations between the two teams. Oftentimes we're just sitting at this sort of fundamental foundation of laying down the groundworks for our teams to be able to collaborate. And I find that there's less questions once you start to lay down those rules or guidelines for collaborating.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, when we put also these people together for collaboration and then increase the synergy, we eventually reach the phase that we also need to make them understand each other, right? Like about their work from different perspectives. How do you ensure that front-end developers understand the constraints and requirements of back-end systems that they are work with, and vice versa? Maybe Philippa, you can share some of your expertise here.
Yeah, can do. My point links a little bit to something Tiffany mentioned about having discussions as early as possible. So in my experience, what I find is having a change in mindset can equally be as important. So you'll hear us talk about front-end teams and back-end teams and treating them a little bit separately. But what I like to do is change that a little bit so that we feel like we're one team, because then with that mentality, when we get into things like the early workshops, we have all of the teams together. And then, as Jeremy said, like, don't have everyone in there because it can get a bit too busy. But if you've got the key members and then the key members of the actual team, then we can have early discussions. We can start to do a bit more scoping. We can go into a lot more detail about what are the requirements, what have been some of the pain points that each member has come across that's relevant to this project. And I feel like those workshops can really act as early knowledge sharing, but also giving you way more detail about the requirements for the project that you're working on. And I also think this boosts a bit more collaboration, because instead of having to talk to each other nearer the end of the project or when there's a specific ticket where you might need a PR on, you've all been involved from the very beginning. So as early on as you can, you've got clear communication, you've got alignment, and you all understand the main thing that you're working towards.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, so when we go through the conversations around the constraints and then understand each other's goal, we are also there in the middle, but also like we need to also understand what are the common goals for both sides. And then this is like what I would like to address as like a next topic. How have you seen shared visions across team collaboration evolve? And how do you align the goals between these two teams? Maybe Tiffany, Do you have anything to share? Probably yes. Sorry.
Yeah, so I'd love to just add on to what Philippa was saying about the difference between back end and front end teams and different kinds of teams. I think we try to apply very specific like methodologies to specific kinds of teams, but at the end of the day, we're all here as a team to achieve like a shared mission and a shared vision. And oftentimes we see like different kinds of collaborations expanding that vision and mission. There have been many times where, you kind of you create as an organization a new team, right? But then there are more stakeholders that kind of jump in and are needing similar work or similar services that a team is presenting. And I find that oftentimes those teams tend to grow in terms of process, people, and then also collaborations. So I think it's really helpful when you are finding that you have a team that is starting to grow, that you start to have missions and visions and everything written down so that it's very clear to various stakeholders what exactly you offer. This happened quite a bit in my time at Vox Media, and it happens also with my team now at Autodesk, where we'll have a stakeholder and they'll come in and they'll say, hey, we want to really use this service and we want to figure out how does this work or play into what we're doing. And I find that the best ways to continue to scale that mission and vision is to be able to present like, what does your team do, who's involved in the team, what do you offer in terms of services, and really opening that up. So I highly recommend if you have any kind of team, to start really documenting like, what services do you own, what are the SLAs, what are the objectives for those different services, so that people can begin to interact with your team's work.
Thank you. Thank you. From that's like, I feel like you touched like a good points there. When defining goals, common goals for the teams, there is also like the aspect of like a product, like technical aspects about the product, that I think that's like it's worth it to discuss a little bit further. And then yeah, I have some questions around that that you can help me with it. Have you encountered situations where the priority of front-end and back-end development seem to conflict? Yeah, maybe Jeremy.
Yeah, for sure. Because typically they've got, you know, not competing interests, but certainly um, competing requirements sometimes. You might have, just for example, from my experience, you might have a backend team who's preparing an API, and then a front end team that has a particular client library that they might want to use, and there may be incompatibilities. Um, I feel like this is one of the key points um, in engineering leadership that comes to the front in these sort of situations where if you're the team leader for one of those teams, or if you're the leader of the overall project, like making sure that the end goal is clearly defined, and that those particular implementation details that can become sticking points for one team or another are worked through. Being able to ensure that those teams come to those questions from positions of collaboration instead of mere competition, or because they're used to using this one tool and they're not used to using the other. I could go on a long tangent, but I won't. But maybe it'll feed some questions further on, like making sure that the teams understand why the other side has that requirement or wants to do it that way, can also open up whole areas of cross training, and making sure that the back end people now get this understanding of what the front end devs are doing and why they're building their tool that way, or making that architectural choice, and vice versa. They can see why the CMS team or why the API team has built things using that particular pattern, and then they understand now more about what the other team's doing and the other team's technology stack. So those are really important points to bring people together.
Yeah. Like what we both mentioned now, I also like in some of my experience also, sometimes we need to onboard new members in those teams, and then having those things documented, as you both mentioned, like the vision, the mission, the requirements, the priorities. I think that's like also like a very good material, like a very good onboarding content that can speed up the onboarding of those individuals and then make the team more efficient. So thank you very much for sharing. We are also having a Q&A with some questions. So I might throw some of those questions you like while we were talking about those topics. I think that we can pick the first one, I guess, because it's a bit related to communication, to collaboration, defining common goals, and clarify all of these conversations. So how do you deal with the perception that can sometimes be applied to front-end engineers as just UI and communicate up, down, horizontally to break that down?
I'll take a stab at that
Yeah.
one. Because this was something, particularly when I was at weather.com. I was leading the content management system team. So we were responsible for the editorial teams, but also the APIs that were going to provide that content to the front end. And the front end devs, they were responsible for building the ultimate end experience for the user. And there definitely, can be some initial friction between those teams because they're like, well, without our data, you wouldn't be able to display any of this fancy content, or, without our front end, users don't get the data that they're wanting. So I think, again, from a leadership perspective, setting that tone that both front end and back end are equally valuable to the end product, without one, you don't really need the other. So making sure that the relationship maybe becomes a little more symbiotic and communicating that across teams and then up to stakeholders can be a challenge. But when they see teams working effectively together, they stop to think about the difference between the front end team and the back end team and whether or not, people are just, glorified designers or people are just script monkeys or whatever the disparaging term is. So, again, making sure that everyone is pointed in that right direction and sets those goals effectively, then you bring everyone together to implement that goal, not just implement their technology.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
I'd love to just add to that as well, because I think whenever we talk about communicating up, down, and horizontally, we also have to know that it's different stakeholders. So the communication is going to often change. And I'm always very careful of what I communicate up and horizontal versus down. I think oftentimes when we're communicating downwards to our direct reports or at the engineering level, a lot of that communication tends to be broken down work, right? It's very clear, oriented tasks, people know what to do, right? And so that perception is sort of, you can manage at that level, that level of perception. But how do you manage like horizontally or upwards, especially if you're working with a team that, with a manager or with another team that doesn't know about your work at all, right? And then that tends to be something that I think I would apply like more of Jeremy's suggestions around. Like you want to make sure your conversations are more symbiotic, are more project-based, are more around the collaboration. What was the business outcome, right? Because oftentimes when you're communicating upwards, you're going to be wanting to focus on that business outcome and what you drove and what your team drove in collaboration with another team. Versus downwards, you may lose some engineers if you're communicating that way.
Thank you. There's like another question, but I think that's related a little bit to our next topic. It's when we talk about breaking down technical silos. So I think we can go further, and then we come back to that question from the Q&A. So about breaking down silos, how do you encourage front-end and back-end developers to share knowledge and expertise with each other? Philippa, you can share some of your insights here, really.
I think this also links a little bit to the question that was just answered about perception too, because in these cases, it's not always going to be technical silos, but I think silos in general, especially with a lot of us working remotely and working maybe project-based or team-based, communication across the teams is quite important, not just from a technical perspective, but from a team and personal collaboration point of view. And when you increase one, it should increase the other as well. So I'm a big fan of L&D and knowledge sharing. So some of the things that I'm doing at my current company and we're doing across the org is putting a big push on tech talks. And so encouraging team members across all of the product teams to share topics that they actually want to talk about. It doesn't necessarily have to be project specific, but it could be, oh, I learned this new area or this new technology. I'd like to share this information, because then that's still separate, but still relevant to tech. And it's another way for other people to learn something new and encourage their growth as well. But on the flip side, of course, you can do project demos. So I think a really big improvement I've seen currently where I'm working is going from not having demos to then encouraging people to do demos of their work. It's really good for perception because it helps everyone have a better view of the complexities of some of the work that people are doing. So that's another way that you can start to combat the old classic battle of back-end versus front-end teams. Because if we're focusing on the project and the outcome, and then we're doing lots of demos, we're collectively talking about the outcome of our work and how complicated it is, and that should hopefully improve that. And then I think shadowing is quite important. So just because we have specialized teams doesn't mean that those teams can't actually work together and have shadowing opportunities. I think it's quite easy for us to say, for example, oh, I might have a more junior front-end developer, so let's get them to shadow a more senior front-end developer. Actually, we want to share knowledge in general, and that's all about knowledge of the company, for example. So you could be shadowing someone in a different discipline, but they have specific knowledge you're looking for, or keeping it back to this talk, having front-end developers, full stack or back-end developers shadowing each other, which is another way to just boost knowledge sharing. And by doing that, you can also get some documentation in place as well. And then I think the final thought I've got is bug bashes. You might have different phrases for that as well, but that's something we're doing at my current place too. At the moment, we're doing them as team-focused bug bashes. And so being able to just put the platform through its paces, make it sweat, try and break it. But there's no way that those sessions couldn't be collaborative across different teams, because that's another way to boost visibility. That's another way, for example, to have backend developers join a front-end specific bug bash, but it also gives them the understanding of, okay, how do these bugs actually happen? Oh, these are the steps to recreate. These are the things that are going on that we wouldn't notice from a day-to-day. And there might even be an opportunity for them to figure out how they could help, how with their specialist knowledge, they could reduce the likelihood of certain bugs or make improvements for features and so on. So yeah, I think those are some of the things I'd say definitely encourage knowledge sharing across teams.
Yeah, if I can chime in and add some to that, one of the things that I've uh, definitely seen in my experience is there is, I think, an increased appetite among engineers to kind of become subject matter experts. So, if someone, naturally knows, or has the majority of knowledge about one of the particular tools or one of the implementation points or something that is of particular value in terms of this overall cross-functional team, um, you know, they honestly like to be celebrated. They like to be acknowledged as that. And you can really tap in to that desire by having that person, not only just lead, like tech talks or, lunch and learns or that sort of thing, or be a shadowing, partner or a mentor or pair programmer, but, identifying them as like that go-to person where you can send other people to the team to get some of that knowledge and have them, encourage them to share that knowledge around to the rest of the team, can have some knock-on consequences of, making that person feel like really super engaged and super vital and part of the team itself. And then kind of going back the other direction, you identify people on your team that are really interested in learning more, whether it's about something else that's going on cross-functionally or just, maybe they just got that voracious appetite and desire to tackle new things. So in terms of engineers, like I've definitely had back-end engineers who go, I'm actually curious about that Node.js stack that they're working with. I want to know more about that framework that they're doing. And so it becomes natural for them to be like, okay, why don't you go work, with one of their leads for, this next sprint and try to knock stuff out. And I do see one point in Anoop, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, your question about what to do when like maybe work is blocked or a team is sort of sitting around waiting for other dependencies. That's a great opportunity to have those devs, pitch in, do some cross-functional work, do some learning, do some shadowing, so they're not just sitting on their thumbs like, playing video games all day. They're actually able to engage and pick up more about what the other teams are doing. I've even experienced that here at Pantheon, being on a cross-functional product team and like getting engaged in things I didn't think I was going to get engaged with, how product is productized and the marketing around it and the, stuff in Salesforce and things that otherwise, 10 years ago, engineering Jeremy would not have ever thought that would have been valuable. But ultimately, it comes from this position of wanting to know, the ins and outs and the nooks of crannies of what the team's trying to deliver. So
Yeah, that's a great point, because also sometimes I see us as like engineer leads. I think that also it's on us also to try to identify those opportunities for them to grow and learn with also the aspirations that like for their careers, right? And then we can definitely align those with the business need in case like we need to ship those, we need to unblock the teams, etc., but also with their own growth. So thank you very much. Yeah, I wanted to pick up that question on the Q&A, but I think that you covered well. And that's like, is there anything else from there? No, I think it's pretty fine. There was a slight, yeah. Yes, please.
I know there was a first half of the question around playing with different team topologies, and I think that's like a wonderful way of also exercising like instances or scenarios in work that we have upcoming that may be more back-end heavy or may be more heavy on another team versus like another team. Like it's a really great opportunity to be able to take some of those really great individuals who are finding themselves underutilized to like stretch them a little bit, like let them be involved in other projects, let them kind of play the role of staff engineer and be involved in other things, because that could be a great way for them to pick up new skills like optimizing front ends, right? Or and do a little bit of tech debt work as well at the same time. So not just being siloed into like a single project or a single team. I've had experiences where when I was leading data products, like we were embedded into different teams because they needed machine learning use cases. So we went in there and upfront we were like, okay, these are the things that we can offer. How can we plug in? And then there was some investigative work, and it ended up being really great for that engineer because they were able to utilize new technologies, get exposure to different kinds of tech stacks, and have that conversation with your engineer upfront. Like regardless if you have a lot of work coming up or not, there are times when I've seen work coming down and I'm like, this is going to be a lot for us. Like, how are you feeling about this? Are you good with this? And a lot of engineers are excited to take on that challenge. And in most of my cases, it's always been like, oh yes, I'm excited to come into the the work, and then we'll have the kickoff call, and that engineer will be like, here's what we're willing to offer. And I'm always so amazed by that. And that's a perfect way to also celebrate those folks on your team and in in other teams as well, as you see people come up and step up into new kinds of work.
Thank you. I just want also to acknowledge one tip that was also shared in the Q&A about sharing knowledge, etc. So in that person's specific case, they mentioned that in the company they created guilds to implement ways of working continuous learning to keep everyone connected both vertically and horizontally. So that's all. Like, thank you very much for sharing that. We also have another question here. I think it's related to learning. Let's read it, and then like anyone can jump. Do you have opinions on how to handle the different overall project workflows? For example, a data pipeline team versus a front-end UI team, where one team is not able to achieve an interactive, progressive output in a way that the other team needs and wants. So, yes, Tiffany, please.
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in on this one.
Sure.
All the time. All the time. And the best way to deal with that is MVPs, right? What can you offer? Even if it's a manual process and it's not automatic and it doesn't work the way that you want it to ideally, right? How can you guarantee, or how can you what can you commit to in a particular timeline? That's also really important. So work closely with your product managers, work closely with the other teams that you're working with to figure out like what are your deadlines, what can you offer in that amount of time. There's a little bit of like Jenga that we're playing, puzzle making that we're playing, right? In terms of like different kinds of projects. So making sure that upfront you're prioritizing correctly and then you know what's coming up will be helpful. Like even if you get a wrench thrown into your plans, you can still like at least deliver something, which is better than nothing a lot of times. And the last thing you want to do is fail a team so badly that they never want to work with you again. Or, and that's like kind of the nice thing is in an environment where it's safe to fail, that's fine. But what if, it's a highly visible critical project and, it doesn't just impact the internal teams, it impacts customers or the external facing stakeholders, right? So those are the things that you kind of want to look out for when you're dealing with different project workflows. It's also helpful to like have a V1, V2, because in case V2 becomes like progress is nonlinear, especially in the data realm, right? One day something can be working really well and then the next day it's not. That's also why you want to be able to say like, okay, we iterated on this and at one point we had this level of accuracy or this level of performance. So let's revert back to that. So that's also another reason why you would want to have things done in iterations.
Yeah, I'll chime in on this one as well, because the times when I've seen this happen most have been when the project was not being handled in a holistic cross-functional project team way, and it was simply, oh, the API team has to do this, we need them for that, and the front end team needs this, we need them for that, and everyone was sort of left on their own to determine what their blockers were. And I think that effective teams in this situation are looking at the whole picture and are doing some discovery collaboratively early in the process, so that each stakeholder with each individual team is able to see the requirements and highlight potential blockers before anybody's even started. So at that point, you can kind of say, okay, so the API team is going to be blocked because they need to implement feature X before they can do anything else. So let's put that, here on the timeline, and we know that everyone else is going to need to we're going to have to find stuff for them to do. We're going to have them sort of waiting for that piece. Well, no problem. We know that ahead of time. We can build that into the project plan. But what happens if you don't have this holistic goal is like, oh, the API team just told me that they can't have this for another 3 weeks. And then everyone's like, well, we thought we were about to get started. So again, that early understanding of what every team needs, early representation from every team, so that they can say, hey, we're going to be blocked to deliver this functionality until X and Y happens. And then you can trace those dependencies back to the planning phase.
I think it's quite important, if I can add one more thing, is like in
Sure.
our role as engineering leaders, more often than not, there's going to be a reason why certain teams work a certain way. And so sometimes it can be really easy, and I've definitely done it before, early on in my career, where it's like, okay, we're all going to work the same way. One team works this way, and then I'm like, okay, it just doesn't work. There's miscommunication. One team might work in more of a Kanban style, and there'll be reasons why, because they're used to maybe more incoming work and they just always are in a state of flow, versus one other team could need a lot more upfront design or a lot more upfront discussions. And so I think what's really important is to understand why do the teams work that way. And that's something that you can get with your peers, so your other engineering leader in the team, and then collaborating with the product manager as well to understand that. And that can also help you work with the team to figure out how you're actually going to work on that project. So You might have different workflows, but as long as we understand why, we can actually make them work together. Because the most important thing is having those milestones, like Tiffany said, and doing a little bit of Jenga and understanding what the outcome is, when are the deadlines, and when do people need things at which times. And so, yeah, we just have to figure out and mend things together, do a little bit of Jenga, and then just understand the foundations of why these decisions were made in the first place.
Yeah, that brings up definite memories, I'll call them memories, of uh, 4 different teams with 4 different Jira boards and processes,
Wow.
one of which was a completely separate server, not even the same Jira instance, and trying to coordinate that um, wasn't my job, thankfully. I was able to mold our process to better fit what everyone else did, but it was definitely uh, that stuff you have to watch out for. And again, knowing this early on is absolutely right, Philippa. If you understand it, you can adapt, and everyone can kind of come to consensus. But that's like one of those things that people don't even think about. What do you mean the API team doesn't have that tag on their tickets? Like who's got access to do that? Then you have to track down someone else to make those changes. So
Thank you. Yeah, we sometimes I feel like in those situations we tend to overcomplicate things sometimes. So like definitely like 4 Jira boards. That yeah, sometimes we struggle with even with one. So like depending on the queries there. So thank you. I feel like we are doing pretty well, and I really like the how we're evolving on the topics. And then I think we still have time for one question that's exactly to close the cycle. We have talked about collaboration. We have talked about defining common goals and understanding each other, breaking down silos. And at the end, we need also to talk about like a continuous improvement and feedback, right? Um, and then here, please, everyone, you can step in and share a little bit. What mechanisms do you have in place to incorporate feedback from one team into the work of other team effectively? How do you run retros, for example, for those teams with so different perspectives sometimes that has some different like dependencies, etc. Um,
I don't mind jumping in. I'm
thank you.
probably gonna start off by going in reverse order because something that came to me is it's really typical and helpful to do retrospectives, but actually something that can be really helpful for communication in the teams is doing like a pre-retrospective, like a pre-mortem or like a proactive review. Pick any word you choose, but basically getting together and having a conversation about, okay, before we start this project, like what could go wrong? What lessons have we learned in the past, which is another way to get the knowledge sharing across the different disciplines of the teams and understanding, okay, let's assume this project has happened, it's been shipped, like what could go wrong? And that's a really good way to get early feedback because we're learning from past mistakes or past lessons or things like top tips that we've got probably lying around in some old documentation that we haven't read before the project started. So before I go into retros, I think, yeah, doing some sort of proactive review would be really helpful to get early feedback. And then, yeah, retrospectives are a classic. It's a really good way. Well, actually, maybe they're not a classic because people usually do them as teams, and sometimes it might not be as normal to do project-specific retrospectives. So I think narrowing it down and having that clear theme about we're only going to discuss this project, having key members, and if you do have that psychological safety, maybe even the stakeholders too, because that input and that voice is quite important. And then being able to really double down on, what went well, what didn't go so well, whatever theme you choose, but what are the things that we could improve? What are the lessons that we're learning? And it's really good to use this as a cool down period as well. Most of the time, we're just doing project after project after project, but potentially allowing the team to have a cool down period is a great way to also gather feedback because if we're monitoring, let's say, the number of blogs that came out after we did this release, and we can do a tight loop of feedback to talk about how we could improve quality as well. So I think those are some of the things I like to facilitate for my teams for feedback as well.
Thank you.
I know that a lot of people host those retrospectives, postmortems, whatever you'd like to call them. I think some interesting things that I've picked up, practices that I have in place is sometimes missing those so that you can give people in the room that safety to be able to share more without you being in the room. I found that to be helpful, especially if you have pretty regular ones with your team and then with like a larger like collaboration team. Sometimes not being in the room can also be helpful, especially if you're feeling like maybe you're taking too much of the too much of the stage in the planning, in the collaborations, and like making sure that everything's held together. It's kind of nice to not be there, or even just like join 15 minutes late or something and mid conversation see how it's going, so that way you can jump in and like get more information without actually being there. Another practice that I like to do is I also like to just join meetings early or stay a little bit later, just in case I see anyone lingering. They may feel like they want to bring something up. Another thing that I also look out for is if anyone is sick or they like are not as involved in the project, it's a good time to check in with those folks because that's often like a sign of extra stress or something else that's going on. So I try to be there for anyone, regardless if it's my team or someone else's team, just to be on the lookout for those kinds of things.
Thank you. We do have one more question, but I'm not so sure if you can answer Sam's question here because of the time.
Yeah, I can very quickly touch
Great.
on
Thank
that.
you.
And the question is, it seems like vertically sliced teams resolve most of the issues. Given that, is there any justification for having horizontal teams? I think that day to day, operationally, you're going to have many projects over the course of a company's lifetime, and each project itself might have an integrated cross-functional team, and that is definitely what I would advocate that projects get. But there is other work to be done aside from projects. So, organizationally, uh, from a team cohesion standpoint, from a esprit de corps standpoint, from a hiring practices standpoint, it does make sense. Like I would definitely say that it makes sense to have front end teams and back end teams and API teams and CMS teams that are working together and being sort of like core competency groups that then combine to join forces like a cartoon robot when these projects come. So it's really about being able to adapt, because day-to-day bug tickets on the API, like, that's not necessarily a cross-functional team function. That's going to be the API team addressing that for, a bug that was for a project that was implemented 2 years ago with a different cross-functional team. So yes, I do think there's room and space to play for both of these sort of team architectures.
Thank you. Maybe Tiffany, you can did you want to add something to this question? Oh, no, sorry. Yes.
I
Cool.
think that was great.
Yeah, sorry. Cool. I think we are good with time then. And that was very exciting to see those questions coming up, and also thank you all thank you so much for all the good insights in today's panel. And after this, we'll all be heading over now to the Lead Dev Slack channel in this #effective-teams channel. So please head there to continue the discussion. Thank you very much, Tiffany, Philippa, and Jeremy for today's. And we hope to see you next time.